All right. Auguste Rodin once said, "The human mind cannot go very far except on this condition, that the thought of the individual be added patiently and silently to the thought of generations. All our lives as moral and intellectual beings are lived within the larger complex lives of the many overlapping communities of which we are a part. In this paper, I will consider the interplay between individual and community in three ways, three sections. First, I will argue that greater attention must be paid to the small-scale, concrete institutions that come between the individual and the large-scale society with a capital S. Second, I'll discuss Dietrich von Hildebrand's conception of value, value perception, and value response as useful tools for understanding our situation in these communities. I'll probably keep that section fairly short since in the previous discussions we've already laid out those Hildebrandian categories fairly well. And third, I will attempt to extend Hildebrand's analysis of value response by arguing that communities are best thought of as quasi-value responders. That is, I think we can extend Hildebrand's conception of the person as perceiving values and responding to values, and then think of communities by analogy with individuals, and think of a community as giving a kind of value response. And since we are embedded in these communities, this is a primary locus whereby we gain moral knowledge and participate in moral knowledge, although not exclusive. I do think that individuals can come to moral knowledge outside of communities. Now, I want to put the emphasis on that last section. That's really where I want to focus the conversation. In the first section, I'm going to push against thinking in terms of abstractions, and I want to push us to thinking in terms of smaller scale concrete communities. We had some good conversation about this at lunch, and so I want to make a quick clarification. I wanted to make that push because I think that thinking about communities as analogous to persons, insofar as they're value responders, is much more plausible to my mind if we think about very small-scale communities like a school or a church or a family or a place of work, and is much less plausible if we try to extend that analogy to the United States as a whole or capitalism or something like that. Okay, and that's the motive for this first section. Second clarification is that I'm not skeptical about large-scale abstract conceptions or their sometimes utility in all kinds of other places of analysis. So here is an example or an analogy taken from economics. Consider the price of eggs, okay, and ask yourself what explains the price of eggs. There's this spike in the price of eggs over the last year, and then it's kind of come back down, right? Is that explained by inflation, the rising inflation in the United States? Inflation is a very abstract kind of top level, hard to really get a handle on what are the concrete realities that are the causes and mechanisms of inflation. And certainly there's a small piece of the explanatory pie for why did the price of eggs go up that is explained by inflation, right? But a much bigger piece of the explanatory pie is the flu that happened with the chickens, right? And there was this disease, and so egg production went way down. But then if we zoom in, the price that I particularly paid for eggs was affected by those two factors almost not at all. I paid the same price of eggs throughout in Kentucky because I was buying my eggs from a coworker who has chickens on his farm, okay? So for some purpose, appealing to inflation as this big abstraction might be very helpful, okay? Maybe for other purposes, analyzing some other phenomenon, appealing to the the bird flu or whatever it was might also be useful. But if I want to explain my particular case and what's explaining my purchasing behavior and the price that I'm paying, we need to focus in on that concrete reality of my friend who has his own 100 chickens. All right. Analysts and pundits lavish a disproportionate amount of attention on society, intoned with a capital S. We worry about the direction that society is going. We pontificate about the changes that the 20th century worked upon society, and we speculate about the impact these changes will have on private morality. At the university where I earned my PhD, we required philosophy majors to take a course labeled Individual in Society. I say this attention is disproportionate, however, because it causes us to lose sight of the smaller forms of association that play a much larger role in our real lived experience. We go to schools, we work at jobs, and we come home to families where we hope to find some measure of belonging. The degree of impact that my place of work has upon me as an individual is thousands of times larger than the impact that society has upon me as an abstract totality. Indeed, we can state this as a general law. A community's influence over an individual tends to be inversely proportional to its level of abstraction. And one clarification here is I'm not talking necessarily about scale. I'll use here in a second the example of the Wall Street Journal. All right, it's a very concrete institution, even though it has a huge scale in terms of its readership. The more removed by its generality from the concrete realities of a person's life, the more weak and inchoate will the influence be. Thus, the social dynamics of my parish exercise a greater influence upon my spiritual life than the social dynamics of contemporary Catholicism as some kind of abstraction, which in turn exercises a greater influence than those of Christianity as a whole social dynamic throughout all of history. Thankfully, I remain mostly unaware of what goes on in the far-flung reaches of that abstraction. I propose, therefore, that theorists would better spend their time if they turned their attention away from the highest levels of abstraction and focused their powers of analysis instead upon smaller, more concrete forms of association. Russell Kirk called these smaller forms of association mediating institutions, and his point was to emphasize the way that these institutions come between the top-level political power of the nation-state and the individual citizen, and he worried about the disappearance of guilds and churches and families and clans. I want to borrow this term, but apply it in a broader way than political mediation alone. These communities not only come between the individual and the state, they come between the individual and the capital S society. And it's only through them that the individual has any contact with the higher levels of abstraction. The kinds of community I have in mind establish this mediation in at least two distinct ways. First, mediating institutions are epistemic mediators. That is, they provide a host of filtration and interpretation mechanisms to the individual. The individual only knows about and knows how to interpret the broader, more abstract layers of society through his life within smaller communities. Without them, the naked individual simply has no tools whereby he can make sense of what is going on in the country as a whole, let alone the totality of our geopolitical situation or the entire sweep of history. That's not to say that the individual has no knowledge of anything at all, independent of communities. Obviously, you have direct sensory knowledge, right? You can have, we've been talking quite a lot about direct moral intuitions, about the good person, these kinds of things. But I'm talking about knowledge of events, knowledge of society, knowledge of the United States of America, these kinds of things are only mediated to me through institutions. To describe this function, I'll steal another term, this time from John Vervaeke, and call these smaller associations sense-making communities. How would I even know about, let alone make sense of, the failure of Silicon Valley Bank or its effects without a concrete reporting institution such as the Wall Street Journal, or a concrete contact with friends at work who are themselves informed by other concrete institutions? The Wall Street Journal has an office, a staff with individual names, and a recognizable company ethos. The economy as an abstract whole does not. After informing me about the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank, The Wall Street Journal and my circle of friends at the office also provide me with the epistemic framework to make sense of what happened. How do I know what the overnight lending rate means, apart from my contact with these kinds of people? We never hear raw data, events presented along with an interpretation and evaluation of those events. Only by living within networked communities that constantly present us with information and simultaneously provide us with an apparatus for interpreting that information can we as individuals form any opinions at all. And a fortiori, it is only within such sense-making communities that we can aspire to broad-scale moral knowledge. Again, I'm not speaking of kind of direct intuitions about honesty, but about our moral knowledge. How do we assess the movements within history, or how do I make a moral judgment, for example, about the culture of the United States? Second, mediating institutions are ethical mediators. That is, the communities in which we live shape and form the way we live by providing the basic contours of the kind of life that is possible and the attitudes we can expect from our neighbors in response to the way we choose to live. Ethics, properly speaking, only happens within a concrete community because it's only a community that has, etymologically speaking, an ethos. Okay? An individual doesn't have an ethos. It doesn't have that communal way of life. The individual can only have an ethos in a secondary sense by the way he reacts to and chooses to live within the ethos of the various communities of which he is a part. By doing so, the individual does his small part to shape the ongoing organic development of the community. The relationship here is reciprocal and additive. The community ethos provides the basic environment and foundation for an individual's way of living, and the individual's way of living contributes, along with his neighbors, to establish the ethos of the community as it develops. As Aristotle observed, man is a political animal. In the limit cases of feral children, incidentally, none of which have been truly and completely separated from human community, we see the devastating effects that isolation has upon the individual. Such children fail to develop even the basic capacities characteristic of a properly human existence and often die before maturity. An individual person learns how to be a person by participating in the life of communities alongside other persons. Again, man is not a political animal by participating directly in the capital P, capital S political society. He is a political animal by participating in the life of Athens, the life of his military regiment, or the life of his model train club. All of these overlapping communities embody a particular set of habitual judgments, habitual forms of speech, habitual ways of awarding prestige, and habitual ways of sanctioning misbehavior. As both an epistemic and an ethical mediator, one particular form of concrete community rises above the rest as enormously more important than all the others. Man is a political animal, but he is first of all a familial animal. Even when the family is absent in a person's upbringing, this very absence is one of the most significant facts about his life. Even when a son rejects everything that his father stands for and makes his way alone in the world, this very rejection is a response to the fundamental role his father has played and must be among the chief elements in a faithful biography. More normally, the family functions as the mediating institution par excellence in a person's upbringing. Through life in the family, a child first hears about many things and also learns what attitude toward these things are appropriate. What attitudes towards these things are appropriate. A child learns by sitting beside his father's recliner that the Steelers are to be loved and the Bengals to be hated. He can run through the starting lineup of the Steelers by name, and he can quote detailed statistics about their performance. More generally, he learns that watching sports in a recliner is simply what one does on a Sunday afternoon, and that football is something that all normal men, and a few women, are enthusiastic about. In another family, a daughter grows up entirely ignorant about football, supposing that the World Series is the highest achievement in that sport, but knows much about the finer points of film and cinematography. She can name several films from the 60s featuring Cary Grant or Audrey Hepburn. And at a young age, she makes sophisticated judgments about their acting. Still another family teaches its children how to quote verbatim all the political slogans of their favored radio outrage mongers. The three sons all know the names of many congressmen, political pundits, and news outlets. More importantly, they know exactly which tone of voice to use when speaking about each. The 12-year-old can even capture perfectly the sarcastic bite of his father's intonation. In the family, the child learns how to respond to a huge range of values, both through explicit instruction and, more frequently, through implicit example. The family goes to church on Sunday morning, and the child learns thereby what kind of response is due to the sacred. He listens to the explicit words of his mother's instruction and the homily of the priest, but more impactfully, he watches closely and internalizes the deportment of his mother and older brother who organize the local worship. The weekly repetition of saccharine smiles and dopey guitar, accompanied by recorder and bongos, does more to his soul than the catechism. It is here that he learns not merely simple individual actions or bits of information, but the entire shape of a way of life, a whole posture and way of moving that includes both body and soul. He develops organically by imitation, by admiration, by mockery, or by showing off. The family sets the boundaries for the kinds of behaviors that are acceptable and unacceptable, and enforces those boundaries through a variety of sanctions and rewards. A daughter in one family learns that tearing the pages out in a book is tantamount to murder because books are something sacred. A son in another learns that he can get away with little lies because they're glossed over and generally accepted. Frequently, the sanctions on behavior are explicit punishments, but they also involve simply awarding or withholding approval in more or less overt ways. Sometimes the background dynamics of a family unintentionally incentivize certain behaviors just by making them easier than the alternatives. For example, a family that is in the habit of leaving the television running in the background may find that they are also in the habit of letting unfinished conversations easily drop off or fade away without ever intending to train this conversational habit. More difficult to notice because it is so frequently taken for granted in the background, the family also establishes the very horizon of possibility for what kinds of life can be undertaken by the child. While it may be normal in one family for a child to think of becoming an artist, this would not even occur to the child of another family because it has no place within their horizon of possibility. No one they know is an artist. They would not know how to begin becoming an artist. They have no reference point for how an artist might make money, and so advance beyond being a mere hobbyist. If asked, they would, of course, know that such a thing is possible, that other people do in fact become artists, but it does not enter into the range of concrete options that they consider for their own lives. What I've said about families can be extended in analogous and less potent ways to many other concrete forms of mediating institutions. People are enculturated epistemically and ethically in their apartment buildings, at the farmer's market, at the library story hour where they bring their children, by the YouTube channels to which they subscribe, or at the local bar. Throughout, however, I want to keep front and center the family as usually the most impactful mediating institution in a person's life and the paradigm for understanding the ways that mediating institutions shape us as individuals. I turn now to consider the nature of Hildebrand's theory of value response before analyzing the way that we might extend that theory to cover such institutions analogically as quasi-value responders. All right, I'm gonna just read this. I'm not gonna read the second section. I'll just sort of summarize it because we've already done quite a bit of analysis already on Hildebrand's value response. One important thing I want to clarify based on the previous conversation is that there's a big disagreement between Sheffler's value phenomenology and Hildebrand's phenomenology that they fought about as friends, and I think should enter into our conversation. We've had a lot of conversation so far about higher values versus lower values, and the error of idolatry prioritizing lower values over higher values and the problems that causes. This is generally Sheffler's account, and Walter did a good job explaining that hierarchy that Sheffler has. Hildebrand, however, thinks that it's not simply a question of hierarchy, but of fundamental structural heterogeny, that there's a basic difference between subjective satisfaction and responding to something that is important in itself. Okay? The basic difference there is that the ground of importance when something is subjectively satisfying is within me. It's the sensation, some kind of satisfaction that I have within myself. Whereas the ground of importance for something that is important in itself is out there. It's in the world, and I perceive it given as such. Okay? So a good example is artworks, right? We've talked about the paintings a couple times. I might look at that painting, and in fact, if you listen to people in art museums, you sometimes can catch these different conversations. My wife and I went down to the Santa Barbara Art Museum just yesterday, and it was interesting to see different people's reactions. There's some very good paintings there. One reaction is, ooh, I like the colors of that. I like its contrast. It makes me feel something. It makes me happy. It elevates me. But it's ultimately about my reaction. The other attitude that I can take towards it is that there's some thing about the painting that whether I have the appropriate response or not is there, and I recognize it as there, some kind of objective aesthetic quality that then I am called to respond to. So there might be reactions on my part. Those reactions are secondary and follow upon the recognition of value out there in the world. Now there's a third category, which is the objectively important for the person. And in Hildebrand's early work, he only had those first two categories, the subjectively satisfying and the important in itself. But he came to see, after some reflection and conversation with Sheffler, that we really need to add this third category as irreducible to the other two. Because there are times where I am motivated by something that's good for me, and I actually don't find it satisfying. There isn't some sort of subjective experience of satisfaction, and yet it is still rooted in me and not out there in the thing itself. An example is I might be motivated by to take medicine, and it might taste nasty. So I don't like taking the medicine, but I do recognize that this would be good for me, and I'm not doing it because of it's objectively valuable to preserve my health, which might be another motive, but I'm doing it out of self-interest, okay, because it is good for me objectively. Okay, now I want to extend this categories of value perception and value response to communities. In many ways, the sense-making communities in which we live function as analogs of the individual, both in the initial value perception and in the value response. I do not wish, however, to overstate the ontological status of the community. It is sometimes tempting to speak of a community as a corporate personality, but a community does not have anything like a unified center of consciousness or an interior life. A community does not act as a moral agent or freely endorse its own actions from what Hildebrand calls a free personal center. And I think it was Walter who read that wonderful passage from Transformation in Christ. A community, therefore, cannot properly and fully say I. It nevertheless can say we. And I think Roger Scruton has some interesting analysis of the way in which a community can say we, but cannot say I. A community does have an organic life of its own that is greater than the mere aggregation of its members. In this organic life, we can discern dynamics that are analogous to, but not identical to, the value-responding capacities of the individual. We can say that a community, by its whole way of life, sees one value and embodies its response in its communal practices, even while remaining blind to other values and failing to respond to other values. Okay, and again, this is merely an analogy, but it's, I think, an analytically helpful analogy that is useful in explaining what's going on. Okay, now, I think there is, the analogy with the first, or with the subjectively satisfying and the objective good for the individual is a little bit tricky, because it's difficult to find anything like a sense of satisfaction in a community as a whole. What would that even be, that sense of gratification? I don't think communities are gratified, really. The individuals certainly might be gratified, okay? But what I do think we can see, and I want to borrow this concept from Hildebrand, is a kind of internal dynamic that has a logic of its own that starts to operate and spin off, that becomes detached from the objective world of values. So here's an example taken from the individual domain in Hildebrand, and I think we can see something like it on the communal level. He uses this wonderfully delightful example of searching for a citation while you're writing something as a scholar, right? And you remember that you have a file folder in your filing cabinet. So you reach down to the filing cabinet by the side of your desk, and you try to pull it open to get the citation, and the filing cabinet is stuck. Okay. And so you become so absorbed in trying to get the filing cabinet unstuck, and it starts frustrating you, and then you're fiddling with it. You get up out of your seat, and you get down, and you're trying to get, and then I gotta get this filing cabinet open. And so you go downstairs to get a screwdriver, and so you're going around the back of the filing cabinet, unscrewing the back plate so that you can unlatch the thing. And so the whole situation has this kind of internal logic, where one step is leading to the next. And what you fail to realize or fail to attend to is that the book that you want to pull the citation from is right there on your shelf. And it would really be much more efficient for you to just pull the book off your shelf, and you've got it sticky noted and whatnot. You really don't need to get at this moment into your filing cabinet. You've completely disrupted your whole flow of work, okay? But why do we do that? We do that because there's this kind of internal logic to the situation that we get absorbed in. And I think communities and communal ways of behavior often have something analogous to that, where there is a kind of internal logic that gets going, and it's not really any individual that's making a particular choice. Of course, there are a number of individual choices that are made, but things get going. An example that I have of this is the way that a company handles its customer service lines, where you call into the company and they have you select the number from the robo-dialer, right, and it routes it through this. And the customer service agents at the company don't like this system. The customers don't like this system. The bosses and the CEOs kind of probably haven't really thought about the system. If they do think about it, they don't particularly like the way. But it's just it got going. Some consultant made a decision somewhere along the line. They bought the software. They had the machine. This was the easiest way to set it up. And so one thing leads to the next, and now this is just the way that the company handles customer service calls. And it's not really the decision. No one ever really sat down and decided, okay, are we responding to some kind of objective value? Okay, it's responding. It is the way that it is because of the internal logic of the way that things have gotten set up in that community. An analog, I think, of the objective good for the person at the level of a community might be something like the profit motive in a corporation, where it is, in fact, objectively good for the company to make more money, right, to improve its bottom line. But again, the motive there, it's not because anybody at the company is responding to some kind of objective value out there. It's the kind of internal logic of the way that the business operates, that they're seeking to decrease expenses and increase profits as part of the nature of the enterprise. So again, it's rooted in the community rather than being rooted outside of the community. The relationship between the community and the individual forms a mutually influencing circle. The life of the community is shaped by the individual choices and actions of its members, and these actions are shaped by the communal context in which they occur. So one of the reasons why I want to resist a deflationary account in which we just see the community as the aggregation of the individual actions is that I don't think we can give a full explanatory account of the individual actions without analyzing the community context in which they occur, and vice versa. We can't give a full explanatory account of the community structures without an appeal to the individual actions that constitute that community. So you get a kind of explanatory circle, a virtuous one, I believe. In many ways, the community comes before the individual, since all individuals enter life already embedded within many communal forms of life, and every one of our actions and attitudes is deeply shaped by this antecedent milieu. Individuals can come and go in a business or a college, but the ethos of the institution has a way of outlasting any of them and exerting a powerful influence, a powerful force of continuity on the new members who replace them. In other ways, however, the individual comes before the community, because it is only through the actions, attitudes, responses, and insights of the individuals that the community can have any life at all. Ultimately, the individual person possesses an inner dignity that the community can never have. We must soundly reject any temptation to think of community in such grandiose terms that this dignity of the person becomes lost or sacrificed. To use the felicitous phrase of Jacques Maritain, a community is not a whole composed of parts, but a whole composed of wholes. Conversely, however, we must also reject any temptation to think of the individual as though he were not always indebted to the communities from which he draws his very life. Just as one individual may be better disposed than another to perceive a certain value, so too one community may be better disposed than another. And here I want to focus on the most important of the three categories of importance in Hildebrand, which is that value perception and value response, the important in itself. For example, I once watched a brief documentary about a pottery workshop that still makes stoneware using traditional methods. A father and daughter team lead the operation with several apprentices. The day-to-day practice of such a community is oriented toward the creation of shapes at once utilitarian and uselessly lovely. The dynamics of their efforts together are more than the aggregation of their individual efforts, as though each worked in a separate cubicle and put their pots together at the end of the day. Working together like this allows them, as a group, to see aesthetic values and practical values that remain invisible to most of us. Before watching this film, that is, before being inducted into this community in a very small way, I did not see the differences between stoneware and other kinds of pottery. Watching them work for just a little while, I began to glimpse a hint of that beauty intrinsic to a perfectly fired glaze over elegant curves, shaped by practiced hands. I can only guess what they themselves see after years of working together. Again, the relationship between community and individual is mutually reinforcing. The ability for any of the individual craftsmen, including the father who began the business, to correctly perceive the values in stoneware depends on that individual's participation in these practices of working together. Hence, we may say that the workshop as a whole has a certain perception of stoneware values. The functioning, living ethos of that value perception in the workshop as a whole is a condition for the possibility of individual value perception. Nevertheless, we may rightly ask where that value perception comes from originally and what constitutes its ultimate ontological basis. The existence of the communal ethos comes from the daily little acts of its members. The father has a deep prior experience, the daughter has her own sensitivities, and the apprentices have fresh ideas. All these and more combine day by day, pot by pot, to develop the living culture of the workshop. Communities can also be blind to values in a manner analogous to individual value blindness. As with its opposite, communal value blindness is both a cause and an effect of blindness in its members. As a teacher, I sometimes encounter whole families that are entirely blind to the value of a liberal education. They send their children to our schools for a variety of pragmatic and social reasons, but the love of thought and imagination for its own sake is absent from the life of the family. The parents did not read aloud to their children when they were young. They do not now read themselves in the evening. No one in the family reads anything unless constrained by outside forces. And one is grateful that any of them ever learned how to read at all. This dynamic is created by a certain attitude toward all things intellectual on the part of the individual members of the family. But that attitude itself only develops and is maintained within the reinforcing know-nothing ethos of the family. Who knows where it all began? I think it's impossible to say. This same example, however, can be used to illustrate another striking feature of the relationship between the communal value perception and the individual value perception. I sometimes have a student from a decidedly anti-intellectualist family who nevertheless, seemingly falling from a clear blue sky, takes a deep personal interest in the life of the mind. Sometimes these students are the best students. Such cases should make us careful to remember that there is nothing wholly determinative about the causal circle between the individual and the community. It would be rather tragic and foolish to think that individuals are wholly fated by the ethos in which they are born, but it would be equally foolish to think that they are not deeply influenced. It is possible to swim against the current, but doing so always requires great exertion. Often, breaking free from the dynamics of one community requires the support of another. This is why I think it's best to think of these as overlapping, like hundreds of overlapping communities that we're a part of, such as a circle of friends, a school, or a mentor. When all communities agree, the combined force almost reaches the binding necessity of an inflexible law. Almost, but never quite. And I think there are striking individuals that sometimes do seemingly manage to break free from all the communities that they're a part of. Beyond the sense-making and value-disclosing dynamics of the community, the practices of the community embody a kind of value response as well, analogous to that of the individual. On my way to pick up donuts for my family, I walk by a little neighborhood garden on 7th Street in downtown Louisville. This garden is itself a physical response to a whole range of values. The goodness of green space interrupting the advance of ever-encroaching concrete, the wholesome taste of locally grown food, the human contact between grubby-handed neighbors working together. Individual contributors do, of course, make their own individual responses to some or all of these values, but the garden as a whole would not be possible if we were simply to add together these individual efforts. Such an aggregation would be more like the gardens that I see in the separate yards on the rest of the street. Although even here we do in fact find a kind of community effort, right? A neighborhood is a community of a kind. It's just thinner. The highest form of community response, which Hildebrand analyzes at length in Liturgy and Personality, is the sacrifice of the Mass. Here Hildebrand notes the special usage of liturgical language. Even though the liturgy often uses the pronoun I, it is not intended as the individualized I of everyday speech. We speak in such a way that my I is joined to your I in the body of Christ. This remains true, even perhaps especially, in words that involve deeply personal matters and profound moral responsibility, such as, I confess to Almighty God, and so forth. At other moments, the we of the church becomes more explicit. We pray the Our Father, and doing so, we together acknowledge our adoption into a common family. In the Gloria, we say, we praise you, we bless you, we adore you, we glorify you, we give thanks to you for your great glory. What do these lines signify, if not a communal value response? In each, we stand together, shoulder to shoulder, facing the glory, goodness, and beauty of God, and in unison, we make these words a response. It is humbling to realize that all over the world, through all 24 hours of every single day, millions upon millions of other Christians offer up exactly the same response, using this very same formula in every nation, in every tribe, and in every tongue. The communal response of the church differs from the other communal responses we've analyzed because the church really is a corporate personality, hypostasized in Christ as its head. The church possesses a mystical corporate life that is more than the mere metaphors we have been using in the other cases, animated by a very real action of the Holy Spirit. The full added analysis of this extra dimension, however, I hand off to the theologians, since I am a mere philosopher.
One of the downsides of bringing together a group of like-minded individuals around two like-minded thinkers is that it's very difficult sometimes to find points of criticism that might then be useful in generating discussion. When I first read Dan's paper, my first read through was like, and I got to the end, what am I going to talk about? And so I eventually came up with the strategy of essentially exploiting the fact that Dan didn't have enough time to tell us all the things he didn't mean by the things he said. To like imagine him taking some of the things that, these are interesting themes, but in a 30-minute presentation, they're, given the nature of the case, they're going to be underdeveloped. What if he developed them in some really crazy ways? That I don't think he really would, but this is a possibility. And some of the things that he said sort of made me think, well, maybe he is leaning in this direction, maybe that. So in any case, this is a preface to say that if you find some of my remarks nitpicky or far-fetched, that's probably because they are. And we've corresponded a bit, and I know that some of these worries aren't really worries that I should have about Dan, but just for the purposes of generating what will hopefully be an interesting conversation, I'm just gonna say what I came up with to say. All right, so here's just a reiteration of what I'll call Sheffler's proposal. Basically that we should resist or attempt to reverse the disappearance of moral knowledge, not by focusing on society with a capital S, but by focusing on smaller scale, concrete communities that serve as mediating institutions for us, that play a larger role in our real lived experience, as he says in one place, and in which we receive moral formation. And I think there are a lot of themes in Willard that would agree with this. For example, we've already heard today Dallas's general description of the good person. He says that good persons are individuals who are intent upon advancing the various goods of human life, with which they are effectively in contact in a manner that respects the relative degrees of importance of those goods and the extent to which their actions can actually promote the existence and maintenance of those goods. Well, this emphasis on the goods with which you are effectively in contact and the extent to which one's actions can actually promote the existence and maintenance of those goods, I think naturally points us in the direction of the community right around you. So, the smaller scale, local, concrete communities in which we find ourselves. So in that regard, what Dan is proposing is very much in line with Willard's sensibilities. Dallas even elaborates on these ideas. This is on page 367 and 368 of the Disappearance of Moral Knowledge. He says, the goodwill and the good person are manifested in active caring for particular goods that we can do something about, not in abstractions, such as the form of the good, that at which all things aim, the greatest happiness of the greatest number, or even my own happiness or duty for duty's sake. Generally speaking, thinking in high-level abstractions will always defeat moral will and moral understanding. So a lot of resonance with what Dan was saying. And in addition, at least four of what Willard identifies as essential features of good persons on 368 and following of DMK seem clearly to presuppose engagement in a smaller scale concrete community. He says the good person treats those immediately around him or herself with respect and care. And then also the good person has some station in life, some role or roles specifying particular goods to be cared for. Those are always going to be social roles. The station will be a station within some sort of concrete community. He says the idea of my station and its duties does much to fill out the life of the good person, for it provides, he says, a concrete setting to influence goods. In addition, he says the good person manifests a definite range of virtues, some of which will be especially relevant to one's station and to one's intimate relationships. So still referring now at the level of virtue back to one's smaller scale concrete community and the relations and roles that one has within that context. And then finally, the good person understands and appropriately respects, and that appropriately here means critically but not slavish and not slavishly, to moral laws, rules, and principles, including publicly recognized moral principles. So in all these cases, clearly Willard is assuming that the good person is operating in the context of a smaller scale concrete community, the likes of which Dan wants us to focus on, and sort of the primary manifestation of one's goodness is going to be in that context. But there are also some possible points of disagreement with Willard. Now, in some of the impromptu qualifications and examples that Dan threw out today, I think some of these were sort of headed off at the pass, so to speak, but I'll just raise them anyhow. One worry that I had when first reading the paper is whether or not Dan was being too McIntyrean. And I'll elaborate on each of these in a moment, but just to get the three big worries out in front. Is Dan being too McIntyrean? And then which of these has primacy? Is it individuals or institutions/communities? A lot of what Dan said seemed to suggest that institutions or communities had a kind of primacy. And we want, I think, to get clear on exactly what kind of primacy that is and whether or not it's true that they have primacy in these respects. Of course, he made a lot of qualifying statements as well that suggested maybe not, but getting clearer on that would be useful. And then third, are institutions/communities aggregates or organic wholes? And here I think he took a pretty clear stance on the organic whole side of things, and there are some worries that we might have about that. And I think this is the one point on which there's maybe a pretty clear disagreement between Dan and Dallas, although it would be interesting to see if we could bring the two views closer together in discussion. So the first worry is Dan being too McIntyrean, and here I've got in mind Alistair McIntyre, and as some of you may know, there is a chapter in DMK on McIntyre, and Willard thinks that McIntyre tries but fails to reestablish a basis for moral knowledge. So here are some claims from Dan's paper. Ethics, properly speaking, only happens within a concrete community because only a concrete community can have an ethos, that is a communally established way of living and acting. The individual, though, can only have an ethos in a secondary sense, by the way he reacts to and chooses to live within the ethos of the various communities of which he is a part. So this is one of these respects in which we're seeing the primacy of the community over the individual. And these are themes that seem to be, or they at least have a sort of McIntyrean flavor. And it really sort of depends on how the details are developed after you make these statements, what kinds of qualifications you might want to add, how we will want to elaborate these things further, as to whether Dan's going to go in a more McIntyrean direction or not. And then a third statement as well, when he says, engagement in the practices of a concrete community are required for perceiving at least some sorts of goods, as in the case of the pottery workshop, right? So for McIntyre, he really leans heavily on established practices within the community, not only as necessary conditions for coming to know some goods, but as sort of grounding the very normativity of goods themselves. And I don't think that's Dan's view, but without further qualification, one might be unsure, right? So does embeddedness in the practices of concrete communities ground or constitute normativity, as it does for McIntyre? And if not, why can't individuals access moral reality and acquire an ethos, in the sense of a moral character, in ways that are not community-mediated or practice-mediated? So questions for later on. The second big issue, are individuals or institutions primary, ontologically, epistemically, etc.? So Willard emphasizes the individual as the most promising locus from which to begin a recovery of moral knowledge. In DMK, on page 377, he says, people who possess a good will are those who can restore moral knowledge to the public arena. That would be done in the practices of such individuals in their communities. And now that phrase there can be read in different ways, I think, but on the face of it, he seems to be emphasizing the practices of individuals as they live in their communities versus the practices of communities being internalized by individuals. So there does seem to be a sort of inversion of the picture that Dan was presenting us with. So that would be done in the practices of such individuals in their communities, guided by an appropriate teaching and proclamation Knowledge is made real to people in general only by living it out in reality, and then, of course, it has to be interpreted and explained. This point is even clearer in Dallas's book, The Divine Conspiracy Continued, which, of course, we didn't have any readings from, but I'm going to cite it anyhow. The good life, both individually and collectively, only emerges from the prevailing characteristics and actions of the particular persons who make up a population. The particular person is primary because only individuals are capable of action. This is a very personalistic claim. Corporations, organizations, and institutions can only function as a direct result of the work of individuals asserting their will. Additionally, for personalism generally, persons are primary in all respects and in all domains, and communities or institutions are not persons. And this was a big matter of concern for mid-20th century personalists who tended to see the totalitarian regimes of Europe as manifestations of a misguided ontology of human community, which saw the community or the state as an organic whole and individual persons as mere parts of those larger wholes. And I don't believe for a moment that Dan is promoting that sort of a view. But some of the things that he says sort of have, again, that sort of flavor. So, you know, again, something to think about and talk further about. Additionally, in her work on group epistemology, Jennifer Lackey distinguishes between what she calls inflationary non-summative views, in which social groups are treated as more than a sum of their parts, and Dan actually does say something very much like that, and then deflationary summative views in which they are not. And the idea here is that Sheffler seems to be in the former camp, and Willard in the latter. So here are some actual quotes from Dan on this. So I want to acknowledge he does make a very Willardian sounding point, and that is that the ultimate ontological basis of the communal ethos and its communal value perception is the daily little acts of all the community's members. That sounds like a bottom-up sort of a thing where whatever might be true of the community is true in virtue of what's going on at the lower level of analysis, and sort of like almost epiphenomenal or emergent or something like that. But then he also says a community does have an organic life of its own that is greater than the mere aggregation of its members. So that's where he sounds like he's endorsing this sort of inflationary view. And then he personifies communities. He just qualifies as saying this is by analogy, it's not literal, but still, this personification can be, I think, misleading. He says a community cannot say I, it nevertheless cannot say, or it nevertheless can say we. Good luck getting a community to speak. It doesn't have a voice, right? It's like individuals can say that, but not the community. We can say that a community, by its whole way of life, sees one value and embodies its response in its communal practices, even while remaining blind to other values. And then we may say that the pottery workshop as a whole has a certain perception of stoneware values. It's like, okay, you can say those kinds of things, and I get what you mean when I translate back through the field of analogical meaning. But why would we want to say those kinds of things? You know, what's at stake in saying these kinds of things, right? And so going back to Willard's claim that corporations, organizations, and institutions can only function as a direct result of the work of individuals asserting their will, here he seems to be adopting a more deflationary view in Lackey's terminology. Many of the examples that you threw out sort of impromptu here were it was interesting to me that you were talking about like the phone system of the business and things that these were established long ago for reasons we no longer understand, but now it's just the way things are done, and no one's really thinking about changing it, sort of unreflectively continuing what has been established. Now, Willard has a way of addressing that sort of thing in Note 19 of Chapter 1 in DMK. Willard refers
which we've all committed to memory.
That's right. Well, I'm gonna tell you a little bit about it, so hopefully that'll help. But I want to point out, this is there, and so if we're looking to generate a sort of conversation here between Willard and Dan, or Willard and Dan's von Hildebrand, or whatever, then this is one place we might look. Willard refers to the role of conformist transmission in group formation. Now, conformist transmission is something that sociologists and anthropologists study. It plays a role in what's called cultural evolution. It's basically a mechanism grounded in human psychology for developing and maintaining social norms which, to quote Dallas, guides human behavior without understanding or even consciousness. So this is like preconscious dispositional stuff. It's grounded in innate dispositions within individuals to respond to others in certain ways. In this way, by referring to conformist transmission, what we might be tempted to describe as the organic life of a community is really just a function of the organic lives of individuals interacting with other individuals. And specifically with regard to your phone system example, they're part of conformist transmission. One important concept within that broad theory is what's called norm conformism. And one area around which you get norm conformism is what they call interactional means. And this has to do with ways in which people interact with one, like established ways of interacting with people. It could be like, manners of greeting, for example. So, maybe in one culture, people headbutt, and in another they shake hands, right? Or something like that, right? And it's like, well, the headbutt thing is great and all, but now developing medical science, we realize that if you do that too often, you might sustain some brain injuries, and later in life that might give you some neurological problems or something like that. So maybe that's not the best way to greet each other. Maybe you should go with the handshakes instead, right? But then one of the things that the conformists will tell you is that it's really difficult to change those sorts of things. You can, this is the swimming against the stream sort of thing that you were saying. It's like, well, you can try to innovate and change the established interactional norms, but you have to get buy-in from everyone else, otherwise you're going to fail. And by the way, given the way human beings tend to be, outside of enlightened liberal democracies, you might get yourself into real trouble by changing the established, and people might accuse you of like corrupting the youth or something along those lines if you were to make an effort at, well, let's stop headbutting and shake hands instead. It's like, oh, that guy's an atheist, right? Something like that, right? And then they make you drink hemlock or put you on a cross and it's game over. So there are real costs, but one of the things one might say about recovering moral knowledge is that, well, maybe we need people with that level of insight and courage who can start taking stands against established norms of societies that are problematic in one way or another, right? So that might be part of the story as well. Okay, I've probably gone on long enough, so I'll just stop there. Those are some thoughts that we might discuss.
Dan, did you want to say anything in response